Hello, everyone. Today's book will be one of the Mr. Men series, and it's Mr. Bump Loses His Memory. Mr. Bump was the sort of person who was always having accidents. If there was something for Mr. Bump to bump into, break, crash, or drop, he would. When he had his breakfast, he would spill the tea all over the table and the salt all over his eggs. Poor Mr. Bump. And there he is doing just that. He would have small accidents. When Mr. Bump cleaned the downstairs windows, he would use a small ladder. Crash went the kitchen window as he rested the ladder against it. Oh dear, thought Mr. Bump. Then he fell off the ladder. Bump! There he is on the ladder, and there he is falling off the ladder. He would have medium-sized accidents. When he cleaned the upstairs windows, he would use a long ladder. Crash went the living room window as he turned the corner of the path. Oh dear, thought Mr. Bump again. Crash went the bedroom window as he rested the ladder against it. There we go, crashing all the windows. And he would have big accidents. When his chimney pot came loose in a storm, Mr. Bump decided to fix it. He fetched a very long ladder from his garden shed. Mr. Bump rested the ladder against the wall of his house so he could climb upon the roof and mend the chimney pot. Crash went the chimney pot. Mr. Bump had lots and lots of accidents. And there goes his chimney pot. One day, Mr. Bump got out of bed, or rather he fell out of bed, as he did every morning. He drew back the curtains and opened the window. Oh, it was a beautiful day. He leant on the windowsill, breathed in deeply, and fell out of the window. Bump! There he goes, falling out of the window. Mr. Bump sat up and rubbed his head. And as he rubbed, it dawned on him that he had no idea where he was. He had no idea whose garden he was in. He had no idea whose house he was sitting in front of. And he had no idea who he was. Mr. Bump had lost his memory. There we go. Mr. Bump walked up to his garden gate and looked down the lane. Mr. Muddle was passing by. Oh, good afternoon, Mr. Muddle. Good afternoon, said Mr. Muddle. As you know, it was morning, but Mr. Muddle, not surprisingly, always gets things muddled up. I seem to have lost my memory, said Mr. Bump. Do you know what my name is? Oh, you're Mr. Careful, said Mr. Muddle. Oh, thank you, said Mr. Bump. And there he is meeting Mr. Muddle. Mr. Bump went into town. The first person he met was Mrs. Packet, the grocer, who was carrying an armful of groceries. Hello, said Mr. Bump. I'm Mr. Careful. Can I help? Just the person. I need someone careful to deliver my eggs. There she is holding all her eggs. Mr. Bump took the eggs from Mrs. Packet and set off down the lane. And, because he was Mr. Bump, he slipped and fell on all the eggs, breaking all of them. Crack! You're not at all that careful, are you? Said Mrs. Packet. Sorry, said Mr. Bump. There he is, going flippy-doo onto the eggs. He walked past the dairy. Mr. Bottle, the manager, came out. "I'm looking for someone to drive the milk float," he said. "What's your name?" "Mr. Careful," replied Mr. Bump. "Perfect," said Mr. Bottle. "I need someone careful to deliver the milk." There he is with the milk. Mr. Bump set off down the road. As he turned the corner, he hit the curb, and the milk float turned over, smashing all the bottles. Smash! Well, that wasn't very carefully... Excuse me. "Well, that wasn't very carefully done, was it?" said Mr. Bottle. "Sorry," said Mr. Bump. There he is in the turned over milk float. Then he met Mr. Bush the painter, who was up a ladder painting. "Hello," said Mr. Bump. "I'm Mr. Careful. Do you need a hand?" "Oh, yeah, please," replied Mr. Bush. "I need someone careful to pass me my paint pot." There he is up on his ladder with the paint pot down below. Mr. Bump began to climb the ladder. But, being Mr. Bump, he fell off, and the pot of paint landed on his head. Splash! There he is, covered in paint. Mr. Bump went for a walk. "I don't understand it," he said to himself. "My name is Mr. Careful, but I can't do anything carefully." It was then that he walked into a tree, and he bumped his head. Bump! There he is, walking into the tree. An apple fell out of the tree into his hand. "Well, that's odd," he said to himself. "How did I get here? The last thing I remember is opening my bedroom window. And where did all this paint come from?" You know, don't you? Just at that moment, Farmer Fields turned up. "Careful!" he called. "Well, that sounds familiar," said Mr. Bump, and he fell down the bank into the river. There he goes, just before he falls into the river. All right. So that was our story. Thank you for listening, and I hope you enjoyed it.